Teaching a misrepresented Christian classic, Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. The Scarlet Letter is one of my favorite works of literature, and it has the added bonus of being, in my view, a Christian classic. That is the viewpoint to which I came partly on the basis of published literary criticism. And for me personally, I know of no greater vindication of my career as a writer of literary criticism than the essays and books that have put the right data in front of me, as I have been a reader of explications. Implicit in what I have said is that classroom teaching of Hawthorne's classic did not put me in possession of the right interpretation of the book. So a principle that I would put on the table right here at the outset is that a great responsibility resides on us as teachers. It is our task to discover the truth and pass it on in the classroom. Discovering the truth, as you know, often requires hard work and extensive research. What then is the received opinion of the Scarlet Letter that is perpetuated in the secular classroom and sometimes in the Christian school classroom? Its main tenets are that the Puritans in Hawthorne's story represent Hawthorne's rejection of Christianity, and that the sympathetic portrayal of Hester shows Hawthorne to be an adherent of mainstream romanticism, with its championing of nature, feeling, and hostility to civilization. I will note in passing that throughout my 45-year career, I have found myself in the position of reclaiming for Christianity texts that the world at large has interpreted as non-Christian texts. I think of Shakespeare's plays, for example, where the myth of the secular Shakespeare continues to cast a long shadow. Or The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which was first presented to me as endorsing humanism rather than Christianity. Or Christopher Marlowe's play, Dr. Faustus, which, because the protagonist flouts Christianity, is offered as a play that attacks Christianity. Or the romantic interpretation of Paradise Lost, in which Satan is put forward as the sympathetic hero and God as the villain. So while my subject of this address is the Scarlet Letter, I will conduct my inquiry in such a way as to suggest a paradigm for dealing with that most vexing of literary situations, the misrepresented Christian classic. I will begin by summarizing the interpretation of the Scarlet Letter to which I came in the presence of what turned out to be a cloud of witnesses who articulated a Christian view of the book. This cloud of witnesses, who do represent a minority viewpoint, was simply excised from consideration by my professors and peers, and sometimes by colleagues within my own department. I believe that Hawthorne's masterpiece portrays three worldviews: Puritan behavior, a form of legalism; Romanticism, with its elevation of individual feeling; and Christian doctrine, which is synonymous with Puritan doctrine as opposed to Puritan behavior. But that is where I ended up and does not reflect the process by which I came to that position. So what is the paradigm that has often unfolded in my reclamation of Christian classics? It begins with an encounter with the misrepresentation of the work, which, however, I do not yet fully grasp to be a misrepresentation. May I again note how influential a teacher's perspective is on a student. Gradually, either on my own initiative or as a result of reading a given piece of literary criticism, I am given data that affirms a Christian reading of the text or some part of it. I myself tend to capitalize on that gain and pursue it to its logical conclusion, all the while building up a case against the misrepresentation. After I'm pretty sure that I am on the right track, it dawns on me that I now need to take some account of the incorrect interpretation. A good working premise is that the secular reading cannot be all wrong. So I credit it where I can, assimilate the part of it that is valid into my Christian reading of the work, and finally codify where that interpretation falls short, usually in the form of ignoring the Christian elements in a text. Secular readings of Christian text are a case study in ignoring data that is in the text, and I feel it to be my responsibility not to duplicate that irritating behavior. In making the case for the Scarlet Letter as a Christian classic, I will start with where the romantic reading of the book is accurate. I have no desire to squelch this data. So I begin with the negative verdict that critics have lavished on the Puritan community. The Puritans in Hawthorne's story elevate law to the highest value, which is bad enough, and they then exercise their legalism in a judgmental way. The Puritan community is the first group of characters whose worldview emerges in the story. Theirs is, as I said, a legalistic worldview that exalts a moral code to supremacy. The narrator describes them as, quote, a people amongst whom religion and law were almost identical. Their elevation of moral law to the integrating factor in their experience explains the Puritan community's tendency to view Hester Prynne, the mother of the illegitimate child Pearl, not as a person, but as the violator of a moral code. For example, the impressive scene that opens the story describes how the community brings Hester out of the prison to the scaffold of the pillory in order to hold her up as an example of moral sin. The same propensity to define Hester in terms of the moral code is underscored in chapter 5, when we read that through the years, quote, giving up her individuality, she would become the general symbol at which the preacher and moralist might point, and in which they might vivify and embody their images of woman's frailty and sinful passion. Thus, the young and pure would be taught to look at her as the figure, the body, the reality of sin. The same thing is established by the letter A that the Puritan community compels Hester to wear. The symbol occurs in the book more than once every 2 pages and is a running reminder of the community's practice of defining Hester as an adulteress, a violator of a moral code. The members of the Puritan community also take their own identity from the moral code that dominates their world. The spectators of Hester's exposure on the scaffold identified themselves as the self-righteous keepers of the code. Governor Bellingham, Reverend Wilson, Reverend Dimsdale, and the city magistrates are the official guardians of the moral law. Throughout the story, these characters illustrate how the moral code is the mainspring of action and governing principle for the Puritan community. How does the Puritan community's experiment in living fare in the story? It fails. The Puritans are portrayed as uniformly unsympathetic in their behavior. Hawthorne secures a negative reaction to them by making them the object of satiric attack throughout the story. He also pays his readers the compliment of assuming that their worldview and morality are healthy, so that we have no hesitation in condemning the bigotry, self-righteousness, sadism, and unforgiving nature of the Puritans' legalism. The final task is to evaluate the Puritan community's legalistic worldview by a Christian standard. Too many readings equate the Puritans in Hawthorne's story with Christianity and with the Puritans of history, which Hawthorne never intended, and conclude that Hawthorne is condemning Christianity. This is surely an inaccurate interpretation. The Scarlet Letter, when it attacks Puritan behavior, is not attacking Christianity, because Puritan behavior in the story is not Christian. The attitudes and behavior of the Puritan community are condemned by a truly Christian standard, as contained in the Bible and the life of Christ. The Christian ideal is one that forgives and restores the sinner. Christ forgave the woman taken in adultery. He did not excuse her, nor did he neglect to call adultery a sin, as evidenced by the fact that he told the woman, "Go and do not sin again." Paul reinforced the same ideal of forgiveness when he wrote, "Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Look to yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." Galatians 6:1 and 2. The Puritan community represents a simple design in the Scarlet Letter. That simplicity is a foil to the complexity that we find in regard to Hester and the romantic worldview that she represents. I would say this very complexity is one of Hawthorne's triumphs in the story. I will divide my analysis of Hester in the first half of the book into 3 main points. Number 1, Hawthorne begins by generating sympathy for Hester as a person. In this initial phase, she does not yet receive an overt identification as a romanticist in the 19th century sense of that word. Romanticism was an intellectual and cultural movement that elevated emotion, impulse, and human freedom from all civilized restraints as the highest of all values. If we're looking for a single term to cover the cluster of values that make up Romanticism, the concept of nature is that term. Hester enters the story in chapter 2 when she steps out from the dark prison into the sunlight of public exposure on the scaffold in the middle of town. As readers, we are all feeling in sympathy toward her. Hester carries an infant in her arms, and wears a scarlet letter A on her breast as an emblem of shaming by the judgmental community. I propose that we respond to her as a person and not as an exemplar of a worldview. Only later do we look back and see that the basic situation in this opening scene has reenacted the usual romantic paradigm of the solitary victim set over against a tyrannical society. Point number 2. By the time we reach the middle chapters, Hester increasingly assumes the status of a romantic heroine or exemplar, and not simply an engaging woman. Here, too, the strategy of the story is to make us respond sympathetically to Hester the Romanticist. I think particularly of chapter 13, entitled Another View of Hester. Another View of Hester. In effect, this chapter is a progress report, after the focus of the story had shifted to Dimmesdale and Chillingworth, and we had almost lost sight of Hester. Hester has gradually won a victory over social prejudice, and we are happy for her. The scarlet letter A has come to be interpreted as able, in tribute to Hester's skill in needlework and acts of charity on behalf of the needy of the community. However, the deeper meaning of the title of the chapter, Another View of Hester, relates to her stepping forward as an arch romanticist. She began as a member of the Puritan community, and as such a person with Christian convictions of sin and salvation. But a single packed paragraph in chapter 13 is a virtual summary of 19th century romanticism. I quote, "The world's law was no law for her mind. It was an age in which the human intellect, newly emancipated, had taken a more active and a wider range than for many centuries before. Men of the sword had overthrown nobles and kings. Men bolder than these had overthrown and rearranged, not actually, but within the sphere of theory, which was their most real abode, the whole system of ancient prejudice, wherewith was linked much of ancient principle. Hester Prynne imbibed this spirit. She assumed a freedom of speculation then common enough on the other side of the Atlantic. In her lonesome cottage by the seashore, thoughts visited her such as dared to enter no other dwelling in New England. Shadowy guests that would have been as perilous as demons to their entertainer, could they have been seen so much as knocking at her door." And in a summary statement late in the chapter we read, "The scarlet letter had not done its office." That is, Hester's social ostracism had brought external conformity, but not inner conviction. But that is only a foreshadowing of things to come. When Hester and Dimmesdale meet in the forest, and Hester proposes that the two of them escape from Boston and go back to England, we get a veritable primer on romanticism. Hester says about her and Dimmesdale's adultery that, quote, "What we did had a consecration of its own. We felt it so. We said so to each other." As Hester moves toward her proposal of escape from the society that torments them, she says, "Whither leads yon forest track? Backward to the settlement, thou sayest. Yes, but onward too. Deeper it goes and deeper into the wilderness, less plainly to be seen at every step, until some few miles hence, the yellow leaves will show no vestige of the white man's tread. There thou art free." No vestige of the white man's tread. I don't need to explicate the implications of that statement for this audience. The romantic dream of escaping from an oppressive society is clarified in the next chapter. I would label it an afterglow chapter, when the narrator says regarding the decision that had been made, "Such was the sympathy of nature, that wild, heathen nature of the forest, never subjugated by human law, nor illumined by higher truth," that is the Bible, "with the bliss of these two spirits." So to summarize my first 2 points in regard to Hester, Hawthorne's strategy is first to generate tremendous sympathy for Hester as a suffering and victimized woman, and then to build her up as a still sympathetic embodiment of the romantic worldview. Point number 3, Hawthorne renders that situation complex, however, by setting up a counter-movement. On a first reading, we probably do not catch the significance of certain devices of disclosure that are planted early in the story. But when we have a grip on the total game plan of the story, we pick up on those devices of disclosure almost from the start of the book. Before I note those moments, let me explain what I think Hawthorne's game plan is. The techniques that I am about to name are well traveled in the annals of storytelling and did not start with Hawthorne. The first technique is the juxtaposition of apparent and hidden plots. In such a situation, the apparent plot is the foreground action that we cannot miss if we tried. In my classroom, I would say, even the archetypal roommate can pick up on the apparent plot. This archetypal roommate is very important in my courses. The impossibly obtuse person, the person who hasn't had an original thought in 3 years, the person who's a total ignoramus when it comes to literature. And of course, I adduce this archetypal figure to bolster the self-esteem of the students who are in my class. The apparent plot is the story of what seems to be happening. The hidden plot initially gets less space and is the background action. We need to pick up the clues and read between the lines. It would be easy to miss these clues on a first reading. To cite an example from the Bible, viewed externally, the life of Joseph is a series of disasters for most of the story. In the end, when the redemptive pattern has fully emerged, we can see that the very things that the villainous brothers did to ensure that the dreams of Joseph did not come true constitute a behind-the-scenes story of God's providence. These apparent and hidden plots are encapsulated in a statement that Joseph makes to his brothers late in the story. You meant it for evil against me, the apparent plot, but God meant it for good, the hidden plot, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive. The apparent plot for most of the Scarlet Letter is that Hester is a sympathetic character toward whom we withhold judgment. Furthermore, in the early stages of the story, the only two antagonists are the Puritan community and Hester, and no one would choose to side with the Puritan community. The hidden plot is the story of Christian belief. By Christian belief, Hester, the romantic hero, is not blameless. There are things about which to criticize her. My claim is that the seeds of this rival view of Hester are planted early. Before I note those, however, I need to introduce another technique that ties into the scheme of apparent and hidden plots. It is known as the technique of the guilty reader. The technique of the guilty reader. This consists of a storyteller's devising a story in which readers are led initially to sympathize with a character and viewpoint that later emerges as wrong. The storyteller traps us into becoming guilty readers, in which we eventually judge our early responses as blameworthy. Milton's handling of Satan in Paradise Lost is an arch example. A literary critic named Joseph Summers coined the phrase guilty reader in a book on Paradise Lost, in which he claimed that Milton foreshadowed a technique that Henry James later turned to good effect in his novels. Writes Summers, James managed to seduce all but the most attentive readers into identifying initially with a point of view which seems sensible and sympathetic. It is only with the unfolding of the action that we come to understand that the original point of view was stupid, unimaginative, and evil. I would not use quite such inflammatory descriptors for the Scarlet Letter, but I do believe that Hawthorne constructed a story in which on a first reading, and to some extent on every reading, we are led to sympathize with Hester's romantic worldview, and then stand corrected by details that Hawthorne put into his story right from the start. For example, at the end of chapter 2, devoted to the portrayal of Hester's exposure on the scaffold, the narrator compares mother and child to Mary and Jesus thus. It was a picture to remind one of the image of divine maternity, which so many illustrious painters have vied with one another to represent, something which should remind him indeed, but only by contrast, of that sacred image of sinless motherhood, whose infant was to redeem the world. Here there was the taint of deepest sin in the most sacred quality of human life. Well, there you have it, the taint of deepest sin. In the very next sentence, the narrator calls the scene of exposure a spectacle of guilt and shame. And then the narrator is saying that. In the next chapter, scattered amongst the prevailing idealization of Hester, we find such interposed statements as, with the sin-born infant in her arms, a question of human guilt, passion, and anguish, sitting in judgment on an erring woman's heart and disentangling its mesh of good and evil. We read regarding Hester that she was a martyr indeed, but she forbore to pray for her enemies. Well, the neon lights should light up. We know who the martyrs were who prayed for their enemies at their point of death. Or in quite a different vein, in the showdown meeting at the governor's house, where Hester is allowed to retain custody of her daughter Pearl, Reverend Wilson utters the sentiment, better to fast and pray upon it, and still better it may be to leave the mystery as we find it, unless Providence, capital P, reveal it of its own accord. Unless Providence reveal the identity of the child's father, that is the hidden plot of the story. In the confession scene, the narrator will speak of how the crowd remained silent and inactive spectators of the judgment which Providence seemed about to work, etc., etc. I have brought the story to the 2/3 point. I cannot finish my treatment of Hester because in the last third of the book, Hawthorne lets the romantic and Christian worldviews fight it out and maintains the suspense right to the end of the story. Before I get to that point, I need to trace the portrayal of Dimmesdale in the first 2/3 of the story. I would say that if the story ended with the forest meeting in chapter 17, the interpretation that the book endorses a romantic viewpoint would be right. I have attached weight to the hidden plot and passing indications of the technique of the guilty reader because they eventually win the day in the story as a whole. In regard to the portrayal of Dimmesdale in the first half of the story, I also have 3 main points. Point number 1, Dimmesdale begins the story as an unsympathetic weakling and moral nonentity. He is too cowardly to step forward and share Hester's ignominy by announcing himself as her partner in adultery. He is hypocritical in urging Hester to reveal the name of her partner, and when she refuses, he exclaims, "Wondrous strength and generosity of a woman's heart." As Hawthorne puts the contrasting pictures of Hester and Dimmesdale before us in the early going, of course we side with Hester and admire her, feeling disdain for Dimmesdale. That is sufficient for many critics to conclude that the story endorses romanticism, to which I say, stay tuned. Point number 2 regarding Dimmesdale. As we move into the middle third of the book, Hawthorne gradually moves Dimmesdale into the role of central character. As readers, we get caught up in his story of anguish and guilt. Hester's conflict is external and simple, being a conflict with the Puritan community. Dimmesdale's conflicts are much more absorbing and are multiple. Hester's husband, Chillingworth, undertakes a systematic and demonic destruction of his enemy Dimmesdale, all of it unbeknown to Dimmesdale. Dimmesdale fights titanic struggles with his conscience and guilt. He undergoes an extensive physical decline, symbolized by the gesture of his hand over his heart that appears some 30 times in the book. Randall Stewart, in his book American Literature and Christian Doctrine, writes, Hester is not the protagonist, the chief actor, and the tragedy of the Scarlet Letter is not her tragedy, but Arthur's. He is the persecuted one, the tempted one. He it was whom the sorrows of death encompassed, the pains of hell gat hold upon. As Dimmesdale becomes the engaging central character in the story, the first struggler, the Greek phrase from which we get our word protagonist, our empathy for him grows. We pity him, even while we judge him. Hester ceases to be the sole object of our attention. In itself, this does not show how Hawthorne expects us to interpret the worldview issue. It is simply a feature of plot that has a big impact on our reading of the story. Point number 3 in regard to Dimmesdale. Just as Hester gradually takes shape as the embodiment of romanticism, Dimmesdale increasingly shows his identity as the embodiment of Christianity. His symbolic gesture of placing his hand over his heart and his more general physical decline reveal a person who believes that sin and guilt are real. The narrator tells us that Mr. Dimmesdale was a true priest, a true religionist, with the reverential sentiment largely developed. When Chillingworth plays a cat and mouse game with Dimmesdale and coaxes him to confess the terrible sin that is destroying him, Dimmesdale replies, I commit myself to the one physician, capital P, of the soul. Who art thou that dares to thrust himself between the sufferer and his God? In the forest meeting with Hester, Dimmesdale replies to Hester's question whether he has found peace by saying, none, nothing but despair. Were I an atheist, a man devoid of conscience, I might have found peace long ere now. Were I an atheist? But Dimmesdale is not an atheist. In a later chapter, the narrator says regarding Dimmesdale's agreeing to run away with Hester that he had yielded himself with deliberate choice to what he knew was deadly sin. So that brings us to the 2/3 point of the story. Neither the romantic nor Christian world has triumphed. Momentarily, we are led to think that the romantic worldview will win, inasmuch as the trip back to England is still on. Every literary story shows characters who undertake an experiment in living. If the experiment is successful, the story can be said to endorse that viewpoint and worldview. Until the confession scene in chapter 23 of the Scarlet Letter, it looks as though the romantic experiment will win. But of course it doesn't. We can trace two patterns that run parallel tracks. One is what a literary critic calls the progressive moral dereliction of Hester. The progressive moral dereliction of Hester. The other is the triumph of grace, as seen in Dimmesdale's confession and receiving of forgiveness. These two conflicting stories unfold over the last third of the book. I have time to show the conflict and its resolution in chapter 23. Since Dimmesdale dominates the chapter, I will trace his development and show how Hester and her romantic worldview shrivel up as Dimmesdale tries to include Hester in his progress toward redemption. The first event that happens is Dimmesdale's escape from the clutches of Chillingworth. Chillingworth is repeatedly called Old throughout the story and in this chapter. Old Roger Chillingworth, as he is called in this chapter, is a satanic figure, an identification reinforced when Dimmesdale says to him, "Ha, tempter, with God's help I shall escape thee now." Late in the confession scene, Chillingworth confirms this when he says repeatedly, "Thou hast escaped me." The most successful reconciliation that Dimmesdale makes on the scaffold is with Pearl, but I do not have time to trace that here. Dimmesdale is on the heights as he moves toward his confession and death. Early in what the narrator calls the closing scene of the drama of guilt and sorrow, represented by the story, Dimmesdale says, "Thanks be to him, capital H, who hath led me hither." Dimmesdale makes a complete confession to his parishioners, perhaps climaxed by the statement, "Stand any here that question God's judgment on a sinner? Behold, behold, the dreadful witness of it." That quotation is a good place to note that God aggressively enters the cast of characters in this great confession scene, as Dimmesdale's references to God are conspicuous. Earlier in the story, Dimmesdale had been unable to move beyond seeing God as a God of judgment. Now he says to Hester, "In the name of him so terrible and so merciful, who gives me grace at this last moment to do what for my own heavy sin and miserable agony I withheld myself from doing 7 years ago." Again, thanks be to him who hath led me hither. The references to God keep multiplying. The narrator claims that what is about to happen is, quote, the judgment which providence seemed about to work. Dimmesdale, we read, is about to put in his plea of guilty at the bar of eternal justice, capitalized. Regarding his sin, Dimmesdale says, "God's eye beheld it." For Hester and Pearl, says Dimmesdale, "Be it as God shall order, and God is merciful." Most climactically of all, Dimmesdale's last words in the whole book are a catalog of God's mercy, a biblical genre. Let me take time to quote the passage. "God knows, and he is merciful. He hath proved his mercy most of all in my afflictions, by giving me this burning torture to bear upon my breast, by sending yonder dark and terrible old man to keep the torture always at red heat, by bringing me hither to die this death of triumphant ignominy before the people." Dimmesdale's attempts at reconciliation with Hester fail in the confession scene. The main pattern is that Hester and Dimmesdale are foils to each other. I've noted the overwhelming degree to which Dimmesdale aligns himself with the Christian view of things. He believes that he has sinned and his sin needs to be forgiven by God, so he confesses and casts himself on God's mercy. His last words are as thoroughly Christian as words can be. "Had these agonies been wanting, I had been lost forever. Praised be his name. His will be done. Farewell." Dimmesdale embraces a Christian worldview with forgiveness of sins as the highest value. Hester has been the romantic spokesperson throughout the story, and she remains such in this chapter. Dimmesdale, on the verge of the salvation of his soul, asks Hester, "Is not this better than what we dreamed of in the forest?" Hester, the romanticist, does not see it that way. "I know not, I know not." Hester, the romanticist, wants to believe that she and Dimmesdale will, quote, spend their immortal life together. She theorizes, surely, surely we have ransomed one another with all this woe. Dimsdale's Christian reply is, hush, Hester, hush. The law we broke, the sin here so awfully revealed, it may be that when we forgot our God, when we violated our reverence each for the other's soul, it was thenceforth vain to hope that we could meet hereafter in an everlasting and pure reunion. God knows, and he is merciful. The very last sentences of Dimsdale's final farewell speech are particularly filled with theological and biblical meaning. After cataloging the agonies that Dimsdale paradoxically claims were part of God's mercy to him, he asserts that if any of these agonies had been wanting, I had been lost forever. To be lost is a loaded theological word that denotes being without salvation in Christ. Dimsdale's next statement is praised be his name. To praise God's name is a recurrent formula in the Old Testament Psalms. And when Dimsdale follows that up with the declaration, his will be done, he repeats both a petition in the Lord's Prayer and Jesus' resignation to the Father's will in his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. Regarding Dimsdale's closing words, Randall Stewart writes in his book, American Literature and Christian Doctrine, thus, in his profoundest character creation and in the resolution of his greatest book, Hawthorne has employed the Christian thesis, Father, not my will, but thine be done. And literary critic Darrell Abel writes regarding Hester, Hester Prynne, the heroine of The Scarlet Letter, typifies romantic individualism, and in her story, Hawthorne endeavored to exhibit the inadequacy of such a philosophy. Hester's apologists unduly emphasize circumstances which seem to make her the engaging central figure of the romance, and they ignore or even decry the larger tendency of the book, which subordinates her and exposes her moral inadequacy. To excuse Hester disregards Hawthorne's elaborate exposition of the progressive moral dereliction of Hester. That helped me a lot, the progressive moral dereliction of Hester. Hawthorne does feel moral compassion for Hester, but her role in the story is to demonstrate that persons who engage our moral compassion may nevertheless merit moral censure. Persons who engage our moral compassion may nevertheless merit moral censure. I agree with Randall Stewart that Dimsdale's confession, quote, was decisive. Its function in the novel is to resolve the action. It turned the scales in the great debate. Though Hester, romantic heretic to the end, remained unconvinced, impenitent, unredeemed. Where then does the anti-Christian reading of the Scarlet Letter go wrong? In my opinion, critics in that camp see part of the picture and suppress the rest of the picture. I often find this to be the case with misrepresented Christian classics. With the Scarlet Letter, this short-circuiting of the data in the text takes two forms. One is the simplistic interpretation of Hester as a sympathetic sufferer and no more than that. However, even more crucial is ignoring or minimizing the character of Dimsdale and his role in the story. Non-Christian readings do not do enough with Dimsdale. They act as though what I have adduced in regard to him does not exist. They do not get the point asserted by a critic that, quote, the protagonist of the novel is Arthur Dimsdale, and the progress of the novel is the working out of Dimsdale's redemption. I intimated at the beginning of this address that I might have come up with some of what I have shared with you on the basis of my Christian intuitions, but I would not have developed it into a full-fledged Christian reading of the story without the help of critics. Let me quote a few more critics who either lighted the way for me or gave me confirmation of convictions to which I had gradually come. I will say in passing that in my noble career of refuting misrepresentations of Christian classics, only rarely have I had to forge my own analysis of a misrepresented Christian classic. Almost always, there turns out to be a community of critics who interpret Christian works for what they are. An early helpful guide to me was Joseph Schwartz, in an essay contributed to an anthology entitled American Classics Reconsidered, a Christian Appraisal. Schwartz claims that Dimsdale's fundamental weakness is not his sin nor even his hypocrisy, but his failure to recognize that God is a God of love. Dimsdale, quote, cannot understand the nature of him whom he has offended. The central fact of his nature is indecision about the nature of God. His moral decline runs parallel with his confusion about God. End of quotation. That helped me a lot. In the forest meeting with Hester, Dimmesdale asserts, "The judgment of God is on me. It is too mighty for me to struggle with." This is in contrast to the end of the confession scene where Dimmesdale makes a breakthrough and asserts, "God knows and he is merciful." I've already quoted multiple times from Randall Stewart's book, American Literature and Christian Doctrine. In addition to what I've already noted, Stewart helped me to see, one, the distinction between Puritan behavior and Puritan or Christian doctrine. Two, the way in which Hester and Dimmesdale embody romantic and Christian worldviews, respectively. And three, the way in which key aspects of the story encapsulate important Bible passages, including James 5, verse 16, "Confess your faults one to another, that ye may be healed." Darrell Abel was a stalwart. I encountered his view of Hester's progressive moral dereliction in an essay, but eventually his discussion appeared in a book entitled The Moral Picturesque. When my Christian reading of the book elicited objection from professional colleagues, I started to research secondary sources to show that I was not a lone voice. I found plenty of support, including critics who claimed the following. Hawthorne reserves for Hester the accents of fear and doubt, while Dimmesdale enacts the profession of the life of a sinner irresistibly drawn into the protective blaze of salvation. Again, the final scene on the scaffold is the acknowledgement of God's power and the confirmation of God's mercy, which Hester has dimly glimpsed, but which she cannot hope to comprehend. And thirdly, the Scarlet Letter, quote, is a complete vision of salvation. Finally, how does this Christian reading fit with what we know about Hawthorne the person? I do not claim Hawthorne as a believer in Christ. My interest is in the intellectual allegiance of Hawthorne's fiction. Nonetheless, the external biographical data is relevant. Hawthorne was not part of the institutional or church-going scene in his day. When I speak of his faith, it is not a comment on his state of soul, but on his belief system, and even more, the religious viewpoint embodied in his fiction. I'll just say parenthetically, that is also my approach to Shakespeare as a Christian writer. Not a comment on his state of soul, but on the religious viewpoint embodied in the fiction. There were two intellectual and religious systems of belief that were candidates for Hawthorne's allegiance. One was transcendentalism, the American version of Romanticism. Hawthorne dabbled with it, even living briefly at a transcendental commune called Brook Farm. But he did not share the optimism about human nature that transcendentalism embraced. So Hawthorne was left with Christianity as the belief system within which he operated. We can say unequivocally that Hawthorne was a theist with thorough familiarity with the Bible and Christian doctrine. Hawthorne's notebooks are filled with references to God, leading a literary critic to say that Hawthorne was innately religious, and more than any other writer of his time, a God-centered writer. That's Joseph Schwartz. Hawthorne's acquaintance with the Bible and reliance on it in his fiction was so thorough that his editor and publisher claimed that when he would question Hawthorne about his use of a word, Hawthorne would almost always refer him to the Bible as his authority. Selected Hawthorne scholars claim the following. As a writer, Hawthorne was freely at home in the Hebraic Christian tradition. Again, Hawthorne's theology was a nameless and indisputatious Calvinism or Puritanism arrived at by experience and insight. That's a towering figure of an earlier generation, Austin Warren, claiming that Hawthorne's theology, I would infer as embodied in his work, was a nameless Calvinism or Puritanism arrived at by experience and insight. And thirdly, Hawthorne is a Protestant writer whose novel, The Scarlet Letter, is the nearest American equivalent to the Catholic novels of the French writer François Mauriac. End of the quotation. Any reader of Hawthorne's best-known story can see at a glance that the entire frame of reference is Christian. So we can say about the world that we enter, it's a thoroughly Christianized world. The religious life of characters in the story revolves around practices like church-going, sermons, sin, confession, and catechism. Biblical allusions abound. Christian doctrines like morality, sin, guilt, heaven, hell, confession, and others are the assumed frame of reference on virtually every page. The assumed frame of reference. It is indisputable that Hawthorne, A, knew Christianity well, and B, incorporated it into his fiction. I think it is true that the Scarlet Letter espouses a more Christian position than Hawthorne lived out in his own life. He is not the first nor last to embody and endorse a Christian view in a fictional work that goes beyond real-life commitment. D.H. Lawrence gave the classic verdict on the need to be true to the data in the text and not to the external biography of the author. Lawrence's aphorism was, trust the tale, not the teller. You have to do justice to what's in the text. And if that goes beyond what is true of the autobiography of the author, well, then there's a discrepancy. What is in the text is in the text, and that is unaltered by the author's biography. Additionally, I think that the inner logic of Hawthorne's story partly explains why the endorsement of Christianity is so strong. Hawthorne's subject in the Scarlet Letter is concealed sin. That reaches out to include the secrecy of Dimmesdale's adultery and the hypocrisy of his high standing within his church and community. Concealed sin is the subject. The only way to stop the secrecy and hypocrisy is public confession. As multiple critics have observed, for purposes of his story, Hawthorne accepted the Puritan institution of public confession of sin, especially social sin. Hawthorne was sufficiently familiar with the Christian gospel to understand that confession of sin in the Christian faith is linked to God's forgiveness. I believe that Hawthorne simply followed the contour of his story to its logical conclusion. Thank you.